my soccer universe, to a review of the action that happened in the first weekend of May. And the big story is, of course, Bayern Munich are champions again. After a 1 year hiatus, they really had to wait for a long time to pick up another title. It's Thomas Müller's last for the Bavarians, and it's the first one for Harry Kane. However, they had to wait a little bit longer than they would have wanted. Also tells you how weird goal difference is basically as a tiebreaker, because even with that crazy draw in Leipzig, they more or less had already sewn up that title. Speaking of Bundesliga, it was an absolute massively crazy Bundesliga weekend. So many goal scores, and the Bundesliga will have a major chunk in this video. Over on the Iberian Peninsula, everything is set up for the big showdowns next week, and we have Barcelona and Real Madrid stumbling to 2 wins. That keeps the El Clásico next weekend more or less alive, although with a win Barcelona more or less saw up their championship as well. But Real Madrid could cut it down to a single point. Whereas in Portugal, it is all set up for the big clash next weekend as well between the two Lisbon rivals. And not only are the two level on points, thanks to the tiebreaker being in Sporting's favor, that adds some spice, and also that the final round for both of these teams is not a gimme. In France and England, it's more or less all about the Champions League races, so this will take center stage there. And in the Netherlands, the lead of Ajax is down to 4 points, and let's start there. Not too long ago, Ajax enjoyed a 9-point lead in the table. Well, that is now down to 4 thanks to PSV beating Sittard 4-1 at home, with Ivan Perisic scoring a hat-trick in the process, Noah Lang also adding a goal. In the race for third place, meaning Champions League qualification, Ferrer now open up a 3-point cushion over Utrecht thanks to 4-1 away win at Heracles. Haj Musa opening the scoring and doubling it up in the 36th minute for Hwang In-bom, and Reed scoring the other goals. Then in a repeat of the Dutch Cup final, AZ gets some sort of revenge on the Go Ahead Eagles, beating them 3-0 away from home. Doesn't really matter much for the Go Ahead Eagles because they already have their Europa League slot confirmed, whereas AZ are searching to be at least seeded in the semifinals for the final Conference League spot. However, they're trailing now Twente by a single point because Twente got a 2-0 away win at Sparta Rotterdam. And the playoff slots are for now rounded up by Heerenveen and Groningen, who got a huge 6-1 win over Waalwijk, and thus leaping into this 9th place. That would be the last slot in this playoff where they would face Twente. Well, after a lengthy 1 year hiatus, Bayern Munich are German champions again, but they became champions on the couch, or in a restaurant if you would like, because they did not quite get the job done in Leipzig. But what a game that was. I mean, Šeško in the 11th minute scores in an almost empty net, but with what a great swerving strike from far out to give Leipzig a lead, and then Klostermann with his ear doubles up before the halftime break. Bayern looked a little bit shell-shocked from that one. However, they came out storming, and then Eric Dyer and Michael Olise within a minute leveled the scores, and it seemed like it was only a matter of time until Bayern will win that one. Plenty of chances in. There was almost nothing coming from Leipzig anymore, and when Leroy Sané in the 83rd minute put Bayern ahead, everyone thought the title is Bayern. However, late on, Xavi Simons finds Yusuf Poulsen, who gets the equalizer. A 3-3 draw, an absolute mad game. And at the end, you could see the Bayern Munich players knew that, well, it really is now a 30-goal swing for Leverkusen to overtake them still. However, it's mathematically still possible that they're not champions. So they were celebrating and non-celebrating at the same time. However, they didn't need to wait long, because on Sunday afternoon, Leverkusen only managed a 2-2 draw in Freiburg. Actually, I think only manage is actually sugarcoating it, because Freiburg had a 2-0 lead. Freiburg are also in hunt for a Champions League spot. Eggestein opened scoring just before they have an Hincapie with an own goal, doubles the lead in the 48th. Late on, Florian Wirtz and Jonathan Tah get the equalizer, Jonathan Tah in the 93rd minute. And Bayern probably thought maybe there will be a winner for Leverkusen. No, there was no winner. And so Harry Kane finally gets his first title in his career. But those two games games were not the only crazy one. There was one definitely crazy, a 4-4 draw between Gladbach and Hoffenheim. A draw that doesn't help either one because both needed the win. Gladbach to get back into Europe and Hoffenheim to finally avoid the relegation threat. Gladbach had a 2-0 and a 3-2 lead in the 64th minute. However, Hlozek and Bakovic turned the game on its head. It was a really open game, and again Hoffenheim cannot hold on. They keep on scoring goals, but they concede even more. Kleinens in the 91st minute gets the equalizer for Gladbach to an overall probably deserved draw, but as I said, doesn't help anyone. Likewise, with a point against Stuttgart, St. Pauli could also have banished any relegation trouble. Yes, mathematically would still be possible. A win would have definitely sealed the deal for them, and they were hoping they could get something done because Stuttgart is only playing for that cup final. However, Stuttgart were the dominant side and created plenty of chances. Probably should have taken the lead through Woltemade, who had even a penalty, but that penalty was 2 minutes delayed because Van der Heijden took such a long time to walk off the pitch, and the emotions were really running high in Hamburg. And so it seemed like that St. Pauli will hold on, but then Woltemade in the 88th minute finally slots one home. Then late on there was a second red card for St. Pauli, and then everything went wild. And so let's go way into the basement where Heidenheim and Bochum played out a 0-0 draw. A draw that definitely helped Heidenheim a little bit more. They have a manageable schedule. However, then Kiel also put pressure on Heidenheim, getting a 3-1 away win at an Augsburg team that is more or less already on the beach. And of course we also have to talk about the battle for the European spots. Bremen had a slim chance, however squandered. They played brilliantly at the Alte Försterei, and even Coach Baumgart, Union Coach Baumgart, said this is probably the best football that I've seen in a long time played here, but it was not by us. However, fighting spirit. Christopher Trimmel with a long cross in, and Rote in the 37th minute pulls one back for Union, and then the game became more and more level, and wouldn't you know it, Benesch finds the equalizer in the 84th minute. So points dropped for Bremen. Meanwhile, Dortmund are now only a single point away from a Champions League spot, beating Wolfsburg 4-0 at home, and it was also Ralf Hasenhüttl's last game in charge for the Wolves as he was fired on Monday. Sergio Guirassy scoring a brace to open the scoring in the 3rd and the 59th minute, and then Karim Adeyemi adding 2 more in the process. It was really convincing for once. The question is, can Dortmund get the job done? I have an inkling they might as well. And Frankfurt also could have secured already Champions League qualification with a win in the derby against Mainz, and they had a lead for Christensen in the 16th minute. However, Mainz were good for that game. They had a goal disallowed by Lee Jae-sung for the equalizer, but Burkhardt in the 57th gets the equalizer. So Frankfurt only need another point to secure Champions League qualification, whereas Mainz are now on the outside looking in. Clearly, PSG very much had the Champions League in mind when they fielded a more or less B squad against Strasbourg, and as a consequence they ended up losing their second consecutive defeat, their only second defeat in the season overall, but I guess now that you cannot get the record, it doesn't matter a whole lot. But this was a huge win for Strasbourg, who stay now just 1 point behind the last Champions League spot. Nice are now also only a single point behind the last Champions League spot. However, they occupy the 4th one, which will be Champions League qualification thanks to a 1-0 home win over Reims, thanks to a Sanson goal in the 15th minute. And that last fixed spot for the Champions League now belongs to Monaco, who jump into 3rd place after 3-1 away win at more or less relegated Saint-Etienne, with Akliouche, Al-Musrati and Balogun getting the goals. Meanwhile, Lyon suffer a costly home defeat, a 2-1 against Lens at home, meaning they are now really on the outside looking into getting into the Champions League, which is very much needed for them because they need to come up with the money. Otherwise, if they cannot fork up the money by the end of the season, they will get relegated. So a major blow. Lyon not likely to end up in the Champions League, and will they even stay in Ligue 1? That's the big question at the moment. And then in the evening, OM could have taken a big step into securing the 2nd spot, which they still occupy with 59 points, but they only managed a 1-1 draw at Lille despite being dominant for most of the game. Guiri opened the score in the 57th minute, however a ruling mistake in the 74th then allows Fernandes Pardo to get the equalizer, and so it still remains super tight. There's only a 2-point difference between Olympique de Marseille in 2nd and Strasbourg in 6th, and Lyon are just 3 points behind Strasbourg as well. So relatively tight everything, and that makes for an exciting finale in France. And it is all set up for the grand title finale next week between Benfica and Sporting. However, it almost looked like one of the teams might go with a little bit more of an advantage into that tie. Benfica had a 2-0 lead at Estoril at the halftime, Aresnes and Otamendi scoring. However, Estoril missed a penalty 66th minute and pulled one back in the 77th minute, so it was possible for Benfica to drop points. However, it was even a closer call for Sporting in the home game against Gil Vicente, who had a 1-0 lead in the 26th minute through a penalty. And it took until the 81st minute until Sporting could find an equalizer through Araujo. And then Quaresma steps up in the 93rd minute to give Sporting a much celebrated winner. They are now level on points with Benfica going into the decisive tie. The first tiebreaker is the head-to-head. Sporting have won the first game, so they could leave potential with a draw even a bit more. And to add to that, they probably also have the more favorable last game of the season hosting Vitoria, while Benfica have to go to Braga. Also very enticing, that one. And that leads us straight to the battle for 3rd, 4th and 5th, which would be Europa League League phase, Europa League qualification, and of course Conference League qualifying. Porto got a 3-1 comeback home win over Moreirense, with Samu scoring the 2 goals that turned it around in the end. And thus are drawing level now on points with Braga and overtake them based on the head-to-head, as Braga only managed a 1-1 at home against Santa Clara, Orta getting the equalizer in the 47th minute. And so Santa Clara now find themselves 3 points behind Vitoria, who get a 2-1 away win at Nacional. Finally, I also want to talk about the relegation battle in Portugal for once, because Farense got a pretty big 2-1 home win over Famalicão, and Boavista even a bigger one, a 2-1 away win on Monday evening at rivals AVS, and so all the bottom 3 are level, and Boavista, a huge name in Portuguese football, have a lifeline. However, their schedule is not very favorable as they're facing Porto in the next round. Rayo start out the La Liga weekend with a 1-0 home win over Getafe in a Real Madrid derby. Lejeune scoring the goal in the 7th minute, meaning that Rayo currently sit in a European spot. Probably the first European journey for Rayo. On Saturday, we were treated to an awful 0-0 draw between Alaves and Atletico Madrid. An Atletico Madrid team that really is already on the beach. I mean, Champions League qualification is more or less secured. And Alaves actually needed at least a point, if not more, in order to stave off any relegation worries. Villarreal then put on the pressure on to Betis with a 4-2 home win over Osasuna, a win that never really was in doubt, having a 3-0 halftime lead and at one point even a 4-1. And with a 3-2 away win at Las Palmas, it's more or less certain that Valencia cannot get relegated, which is massive considering where they were in the winter. However, this 3-2 win at Las Palmas also means that Las Palmas are now in a real bind, having a 3-point deficit to the salvaging 17th spot. Hugo Duro was the man of the match, scoring a brace in that one. Barcelona were clearly focused only on the return leg in Milan on Tuesday evening, and they went to last place Valladolid and found themselves 1-0 down in the 6th minute. Valladolid actually played with a lot of grit. However, during the game then, Flick brings on Yamal, the young Rafinha, and the game starts to turn. Rafinha gets the equals in the 54th minute, and just 6 minutes later, Fermin Lopez gets the winner, and then Barca were in full control of that match. This also meant they had temporarily a 7-point cushion onto Real Madrid, so it was imperative for Real Madrid to keep up with Barca to kind of keep the Clásico also alive. And after 40 minutes, they enjoyed a 3-0 lead over high-flying Celta Vigo. Arda Güler and a brace by Mbappé securing that one. However, then Celta pulled 2 back by the 76th minute, and it was really nervy. However, Madrid hang on. It may not be likely, but the 2-2 between Sevilla and Leganés really showed how bad Sevilla are at the moment. If they wouldn't have accrued that many points in the fall, they would be in real relegation trouble. In fact, they have not won a single home game since Jesus Navas has retired. It was an awful showing. It is a point for Leganés. That's probably too little to survive. But if there isn't a big change at Sevilla, they might be battling against the relegation next season. City Royals Betis have a completely different perspective. They are eyeing the Champions League and they keep themselves alive with a comeback win against Espanyol, an Espanyol team that has been performing really well as of late. And it was a late comeback. First Lo Celso and then a brilliant shot by Antony in the 91st minute. It was very much an Arjen Robben goal that give Betis the 3 points and they stay a point behind Villarreal. The Basque derby between Real Sociedad and Athletic Club was really not much to talk home about. Real Sociedad a little bit better, but it ends in a 0-0 draw. And on Monday evening, Stuani secures a 1-0 win over Mallorca. Huge 3 points, meaning Girona is more or less out of relegation trouble themselves. Let's finish this week's recap in the Premier League, where it really seems like it's the money teams that will end up in the 5 Champions League spots. Something that was underlined by Forest losing at home to Brentford 2-0. Brentford, who still have a tiny chance to maybe sneak into the Conference League. Then on Friday, City got a massive 1-0 home win over Wolves. Kevin De Bruyne scoring the winning goal that at that time was against the run of play. But slowly City putting some results together and are most likely finishing at least in 3rd place. And that's a bad season for them. Yuri Tielemans gets the early important winning goal for Villa over Fulham in a game that Villa more or less dominated, keeping the chances for Villa to potentially make it back into the Champions League just about alive. In a dead rubber, Everton managed only a 2-2 draw at already relegated Ipswich, even though they had a 2-0 lead in the first half. And in a duel between the 2 worst teams of the league, it's Leicester who get a 2-0 win over Southampton. However, the big scene, of course, was Jamie Vardy blowing the whistle when the referee was lying on the ground and needed treatment, and so the play was called dead, thanks to Vardy being the referee for a sec. And unlike their fellow Champions League semi-finalists, Arsenal only saved 2 players for their return leg against PSG, but they were ahead 1-0. However, this Bournemouth team is not to be underestimated, and they hit back with Dean Huyson and Evan Nielsen turning the game around, and Bournemouth are now in the pole position to grab this 8th spot, which in case City wins the FA Cup would mean Conference League. United also had only eyes for the return leg at home against Athletic Club, and even though they took a 1-0 lead through Mason Mount, they found themselves 4-1 down at Brentford, a Brentford team that is still sort of fighting for Europe. 4-1 in the 74th minute, and very late on, Garnacho and Diallo pull 2 back. A late Isak penalty salvages a point for Newcastle at Brighton, who had taken the lead through Minte in the first half. However, in the second half, there were at least 2 more calls for a penalty for Newcastle, who deserved that draw and potentially even more. In one of the deadest of dead robbers, West Ham and Spurs play out a 1-1 draw. Chelsea made the guard of honor for Liverpool. However, that's also where the pleasantries ended. Chelsea being 3-1 winners on the afternoon. Enzo Fernandez opening scoring only in the 3rd minute. A Kwanzaa own goal doubles the lead for Chelsea. Van Dijk late on pulls one back, but then Palmer gets finally a goal again from the penalty spot. And on Monday evening, it was more points dropped for Forest in a 1-1 draw away to Crystal Palace, who had taken the lead through an Eze penalty. However, 4 minutes later, Murillo gets the equalizer. Palace clearly only focusing on that FA Cup final. Well, that ends our little trip through Europe once again. I have the question for you. Who do you think will win the big clash in Portugal between Benfica and Sporting? And will this decide the championship, or will there be another twist in the tail? And the same thing, of course, goes for El Clásico, although there the situation is a little bit more one-sided towards Barcelona. In any case, please drop a line below to answer these questions, and with any other comments that you may have, give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video, subscribe to my channel if you want to see more videos like these, and I'll talk to you soon about more things in my soccer universe. Bye! Hey there, I really hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, here are some videos and playlists that you may enjoy too. Also, please consider subscribing to my channel and hit the little bell icon so you get notified whenever something happens in my soccer universe. And with that, have a wonderful day. Bye!